Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, military doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, and turn them into lessons that we can use in our business and professional lives. So today, for those of you who saw the social media posts, the today's show was titled um, uh, "Achieving Success with Requires a Well-Defined Mission." Right, and this may sound completely pedestrian. Well, of course, but I think for most of us, we don't give enough time to thinking about really what is it we're seeking to achieve and formulating that into into formulating it in a way that we can actually tell whether we've achieved it or not. So, for example, um, someone might have a YouTube channel like mine, okay, and their goal may be to become the most influential YouTube channel in the world. Let's make that a lofty goal, okay? But what does that mean? How do we measure that? Right? And so this is the crux of it. So what I'm going to be talking about today are the wars that have been lost and won by the United States over our 200 and what 50 roughly 250 year history, okay, 248-year history, and showing you how this issue really impacted whether we could claim the war was won or lost. So, over the last roughly 250 years, the United States has been involved in 12 wars. Now, some of you may count them differently. There have been conflicts that we've been involved with that perhaps don't rise to the level of an actual war. There are conflicts included in this list that technically are not a war because war was not declared by Congress, and it's only Congress can declare war. Yet, for example, we talk about the Korean War as a war, even though it was actually a police action under the auspices of the United Nations. Nonetheless, I'm going to talk about these 12 and show you how having a well-defined mission for that war really was how we were able is how we're able to determine whether the war was successful or not. So the first war in which America as a nation was involved was, of course, the American Revolution, or the War for Independence. Now, I prefer the name the War for Independence because it states in the name of the war what the goal for that military action was. Okay. The Revolutionary War, okay, it was a revolution from this situation to that situation or whatever. It really doesn't describe what it was all about. But the War for Independence was essentially the war that we fought in order to achieve our independence from Great Britain. That was the goal of the war, to set up an independent country, right? And we know that because at the Continental Congress, the delegates put together the Declaration of Independence, right? Which those of you who joined me on this past 4th of July, I read, and it actually outlined the whys and the wherefores of the United States. It created the United States, and its reason for fighting this war and becoming an independent country. And in fact, at the end of when the war ended in 1783, the United States was an independent, separate country. It was no longer part of the British Empire, or for that matter, what became the Commonwealth of Great Britain, whereas Canada, which is also an independent country, remains part of the British Commonwealth. The United States does not. We became a fully independent country in 1983. I'm sorry, in 1783. Excuse me. Now, the next war we fought is what's known as the War of 1812 because it started in 1812. And on some level, just the name of the war tells you that the goal was what was the goal of this war? So the war really started over issues of the British impressment of American seamen, which means they would stop an American vessel. They would take sailors off of that vessel and force them to work on British vessels. That's what we call the impressment of American sailors. There was also the Great Britain was interfering in our trade, our international trade, and also in order to harass the United States, Great Britain was supporting attacks by Native Americans, especially on American settlers on kind of the western borders of the colonies. And so the War of 1812 was essentially fought in order to address these issues of British interference in American affairs. Now, it's typically marked as a win for the United States, but the reality is that it didn't. I mean, it didn't really stop these things. So Great Britain continued to foment unrest among Native Americans and violence between Americans and Native Americans continued. Great Britain still sought to have an influence on our trade. There was no way they were not going to, right? We were two seafaring nations competing to carry trade and to move goods around. And so in the end, the war ended up in a treaty, but it didn't really change much in terms of how things worked going forward. And I would argue that because there was no clear goal, like defeating the British and colonizing them or something. Not of course, we weren't going to do that, but the idea of stopping British influence in American affairs, what does that even mean, right? To this day, Great Britain has influence in American affairs, and we have influence in British affairs. That is the nature of countries interacting, right? So there's no clear, well-defined mission that we sought through fighting that war, and as a result, there wasn't really a clear win in that war. Okay, so the next war is the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. Now, this is kind of an interesting war because it grew out of this idea of manifest destiny. This was the philosophy that the United States was bound to control the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. That was our destiny, our manifest destiny, right? To essentially take over the middle swath of the North American continent. And the foreign power that was in our way was Mexico, right? Mexico had recently become independent from Spain, and Mexico really held a great deal of the territory that is now Texas and the American Southwest. And so, if we were going to achieve this manifest destiny, we had to get rid of Mexico. That's really what it came down to. And so some would say the United States legitimately fought. Others would say that They created, conflict in order to start the war. But in any event, this war between the United States and Mexico that ended in 1848 under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Okay, that treaty, among other things, ceded to the United States most of the southwest portion of the country, including California, Arizona, New Mexico. I think it included parts of Nevada and Colorado as well. So that whole sort of southwest quarter of the United States was gained through the United States winning the Mexican-American War. Okay, other things happened as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but they were ancillary to these territorial gains, right? And as well, we didn't really get Texas through the Mexican-American War. Texas declared itself independent from Mexico and then fought a war of its own in order to sustain that independence from Mexico. That's the famous battle at the Alamo and other battles within Texas. And then Texas voluntarily became part of the United States. And in fact, because of that, excuse me, Texas remains the only country that on some level, the only state, I mean, that on some level can legitimately secede from the United States, because it was an actual independent country before it became part of the United States, whereas none of the other states were independent countries. They were states, but they weren't nations in the meaning of that word. Okay, so the Mexican-American War was a win for the United States because we gained what our objective was, which was our manifest destiny. At the end of 1848, the United States now spanned from coast to coast. Okay? All right, the next war was the American Civil War, which was fought from 1861 to 1865. Now, the two parties obviously were separate parts of the United States, the North and the South, and they had diverging goals. So the Confederacy sought to secede from the Union and become its own country. Okay, and the North, the original goal, as stated by President Lincoln, was to maintain the Union. In other words, maintain the United States as an overall whole country, and that eventually came to include the abolition of slavery. And indeed, the North, of course, won that war, and the Union was sustained. So while if either side had won, I guess you could claim that America won that war, but America, as the country it was pre-Civil War, won the Civil War. The Union was maintained, and in the what was it, the 19th Amendment, I believe, slavery was abolished, and the Southern states that had rebelled, in order to become part of the Union, had to pass the 19th Amendment, and so both of the stated objectives of that war were met. So that was a war won. So then things were pretty calm for about almost 50 years, well, for 50 years or thereabouts, for about 45 years, because the next war was the Spanish-American War of 1898. It was a short war, and it was a war with really not a well-defined mission. We wanted to support Cuban independence. We wanted to respond to the explosion that sunk the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which historians, I think, still debate to this day whether that was the Spanish government in Havana who caused it, which is what the newspapers reported, especially the Hearst newspapers, or whether it was an accident caused by people on the ship, or whether it was something that was done on purpose by the United States in order to build up, a war fervor, right? But in any event, in the end, while the United States ended up getting control over some former Spanish territories, that we still have control over two of them today. Those that is of Puerto Rico and Guam. We also gained control over the Philippines. We eventually um, essentially gave the Philippines their freedom. They became a country independent from both the United States and Spain. But that wasn't the objective of the war. So while people talk about the Spanish American War as being a war of colonialism, it really wasn't. I mean, it was just this sort of jingoistic, undefined military action that the United States got involved with. Of course, there was the famous ride up San Juan Hill that helped make Theodore Roosevelt so famous, and things like that. But in the end, while I guess we won, right? But what is it that we won? Who knows? I mean, gaining territory, Guam, Puerto Rico. What did these really do for us? I mean, I know we have a military base in Guam, of course, but at the time there was no need for that. It wasn't really anything that was of use to the United States, and so again, because there was no, and by the way, it didn't stop really conflict in these areas. Um, Even today, there's conflict in Puerto Rico because some Puerto Ricans, they want to become a state. Others want Puerto Rico to be an independent country. You have something similar going on in Guam. So nothing really was settled. Whereas if you look at the continental United States, you really don't see any significant action to try and make um, Arizona an independent country or something like that. It's a well settled issue. All right. So then next up on the war hit parade is World War One. Now this is kind of an interesting conflict because World War One started in 1914 in Europe, and I know when I was growing up, and I learned that the United States was involved in World War One. I thought we got involved, pretty much at the beginning. But indeed, we were actually only involved in World War One for about a year and a half. We got involved around April of 1917, and the war ended in November of 1918 on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour of 1918. That's when combat action stopped in World War One. And Woodrow Wilson, who was president at that time, he kept the United States out of World War One during his first term, and then he touted that he had kept us out of the war as part of his run for a second term as president. And it was only as things started really heating up in Europe and turning against the Allied powers, mostly Great Britain, France, and Russia, that eventually Woodrow Wilson changed his mind and sent the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, headed up by General John Pershing, to Europe to help out the Allied forces against the Central Powers. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, I've talked about different parts of World War One, different battles over the last couple of months, I think. Here's the thing: the U.S.'s goal in World War One was basically to support the Allied powers and and help them win the war, which they sort of did. I mean, here's the thing about World War One: the Allied powers eventually got Germany and Austria-Hungary to admit defeat. However, for students of World Wars One and Two, World War One was really World War One and Two in a way. They were one large conflict over a long period of time, because really nothing was settled as a result of World War One, because again there were no clear goals other than um, defeat Germany, and Germany was defeated, but it was just after that it was just sort of turned away from, and hence the things that happened there were the precursor to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, and World War II. So although again you could make a case that World War One, we won World War One, um, in a way that win isn't so clear, I would argue, because 20 years later, it's basically 20 years later, we were back at war in Europe. So, and I would argue the reason that's the case is because we didn't have a clear goal for World War One. And when I say a clear goal, what I mean is both a goal of winning and then what happens. Okay. Now, contrast that with World War II. Okay. In World War II, which started in Europe in 1939, okay, and the U.S. was not officially involved in that war until December 7th, 1941, with Pearl Harbor. But the U.S. was involved a lot in supplying military hardware, ships, in convoying merchant ships across the Atlantic, those sorts of things. Okay. So within about a month and a half of the US declaring war on Germany and Japan, Winston Churchill and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, I should say, met in Casablanca in northern Africa, and they issued a decree that the war would be won when the Axis powers, essentially Germany and Japan, um, uh, um, were unconditionally, they surrendered unconditionally, right? That was how the war would be won. Now, the interesting thing about this is while Germany did end up surrendering unconditionally in, I believe it was May of 1945, okay, the Japanese actually didn't technically unconditionally surrender. So the surrender message that the Japanese Imperial Japan issued was, we'll surrender as long as the emperor can stay, at least as the figurehead of our government. And the United States, after dropping the two atomic bombs and getting that message, the United States accepted that as being an unconditional surrender, because power was taken away from the emperor, so he remains a figurehead, but he had no authority within the government any longer. Now, the thing about World War II that's different and constitutes an actual win was having unconditionally defeated both Japan and Germany. The United States, in the case of Japan, and the United States and her allies, Great Britain, France, and Russia, in the case of Germany, occupied these conquered nations. And they reformed them in a way that they would be functioning nations, okay, that would become allies of their respective countries, and therefore we wouldn't have a repeat of what happened after World War One. So again, there was a very clear mission for World War II. Okay, get unconditional surrender by our enemies, and then largely remake these countries in our images. And so until the reunification of Germany in 1990 and 1989, when President Reagan was president, you had Japan, which was economically and politically to a great deal remade in the image of the United States. And you had West Germany, that was largely remade in the image of the United States, France, and Great Britain. And you had East Germany, which was largely remade in the image of the Soviet Union, right? And while the Cold War followed on between the United States and Russia, essentially, there was no hot war. So from the end of World War II in 1945 until the Soviet Union fell in 1991, there was not a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, what there were a couple of proxy wars, and by the way, at that time, during that period, unlike now where it's reversed, China was kind of a proxy state for the Soviet Union. And so in 1950 through 1953, we fought the so-called Korean War to stop the spread of communism. Okay, that was the goal of that war. Did it work? Not really. Yes. So what ended up happening was Korea ended up partitioned at the end of the war, which is the same situation we were in at the beginning of the war. So while many people consider the Korean War to be an American victory, we didn't achieve our goal. We didn't stop the spread of communism. Half of Korea basically became communist. It is till this day, right? North Korea is a terribly poor country. The people there are malnourished. If you look at the size of a North Korean versus a South Korean, their North Koreans are much smaller. The quality of life in North Korea is much worse than it is in South Korea, which is a modern democracy and has a vibrant economy and a vibrant society. So again, although maybe technically the Korean War is considered a victory, we didn't, because the goal, what does it mean to stop the spread of communism? To stop it from spreading to South Korea? Is that enough of a spread? Or to stop it spreading to Korea in total? Well, for sure we lost that, right? To stop it spreading from other places in the world? No, that didn't happen. Cuba became communist after the Korean War was over. So what does it mean to stop the spread of communism, right? And that's a very ill-defined goal. And so because of that, there's no way to tell whether we really won or lost the Korean War. I would argue we lost it, by the way, because communism has spread, and more to the point, Marxist ideals have spread even into this country, right? So they become much more pronounced in the last few years than they ever were back in the 1960s, 70s, and certainly the 80s, right? And so because we had this ill-defined goal, we ended up essentially losing that war. And that's very similar to what happened in the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War also was supposed to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Now, that didn't work. For sure, the United States lost the Vietnam War because eventually the United States withdrew from South Vietnam, and North Vietnam, the communist part of Vietnam, took over South Vietnam, and the whole country became a communist country. So again, this sort of vague idea of stopping the spread of communism, not a well-defined goal, and therefore it resulted in a war lost. Now, it wasn't until 1990 and what's called the first Gulf War, or just the Gulf War, that once again we had a very well defined mission there so that we could actually determine whether we won or lost a war. So the Gulf War that lasted from 1990 to 1991, the purpose of that war was to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait and reverse the annexation of Kuwait by Iraq and reestablish it as an independent country. And we did, right? And so we won the first Gulf War. Now, hopefully the United States could win a war against Iraq, right? But because we had that well-defined objective of essentially freeing Kuwait and reestablishing it as an independent country, right? We can, claim victory in that war. Okay, now contrast that with the other two. Well, with the second Gulf War, which is the Iraqi War, which was from 2003 until 2011, and the war in Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021. So the goal of the war in Afghanistan was to topple the Taliban and create a situation where Afghanistan could no longer be used as a haven for terrorists to launch attacks against the United States and our allies. And where are we after 20 years of warfare? The Taliban is in control of Afghanistan. So again, we clearly ended up losing that war. And again, I mean, what does it mean to dismantle the Taliban, which is how it was usually versed? What does that mean? To literally kill every member of the Taliban? Well, that's not possible, right? The only way to defeat a regime. So, for example, in World War II, we defeated the Nazis. Did we kill every Nazi? No, absolutely. We clearly did not. Okay, what we did is we got the leaders of the Nazi regime to unconditionally surrender. And then we occupied their country and we completely reformed it in our own image, essentially. And in part of that were the Nuremberg trials, where former Nazis were put on trial for war crimes. Many of them were found guilty and executed or imprisoned, right? So we essentially completely devastated the country, not just militarily and economically, but socially as well, and then rebuilt it from the ground up. That's the only way that a war against essentially an ideology can be won, is you have to destroy any ability for that ideology to be recreated in the country. And it takes decades, right? It took from the end of World War II until really into 1989, 1990, to rebuild Germany and reunify it into one democratic country. So it took, 35 years? Is that right? 35, 40, 50, 80? Yeah, no, 45 years. It took 45 years to recreate Germany into a viable ally of the United States, and one that wasn't dominated by an evil philosophy like Nazism, right? And we didn't do that in Kuwait. Now you could say we should never have gone in. Those are great arguments to have over, or discussions to have over bourbon, but there is no arguing that for all intents and purposes we lost the war in Afghanistan. And similarly, the Iraqi war, which started in 2003, initially its intention was to topple Saddam Hussein and get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, the WMD. Right now, a lot has been talked about that there were never any weapons of mass destruction found, and this was, President Bush's fault, and blah 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 blah. The fact of the matter is, both the Clinton and second Bush administrations believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We've never sifted through every single grain of sand in the country. We didn't find them, after a long search. Who knows? Maybe they were there. Maybe it was bad U.S. intelligence. Who knows? But here's the bottom line. What ended up happening was that war morphed into building a democratic government in Iraq. But here's the problem, and why we lost the Iraqi war. Same as with the Afghanistan war, and that is, it takes close to half a century to rebuild Germany in our image. And German society, German culture was more similar to the United States than a Middle East culture like Iraq, which is a much more tribal culture. It has very different cultural norms. So the idea that we would be able to recreate Iraq in our image in what amounted to not even 10 years, very, very foolish, wasn't going to happen. And hence, Iraq now, it is really not an ally of the United States. A lot of bad things come out of Iraq. And hence why I would argue that we lost the Iraqi war as well. So in sum total, we actually, out of the 12 wars, we only actually won 5 of them. 5 of the 12 wars the United States has been involved with: the American Revolution, or the War for Independence, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, World War II, and the Gulf War. Those are the 5 we won. Now, we might be able to make the case that, in fact, we did topple the Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. And if that had been our only goal, then perhaps we could have claimed to have won the Iraqi war. And you might be able to claim that we won the World War I, although it was somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory. So we're about 50-50 maybe. And that largely comes down to what our understanding was of victory. So too, in our businesses, our mission needs to be concrete. Okay, so for example, if we are, let's say we have some kind of product manufacturing company. Let's say we make trucks. Okay, so here's Elon Musk. I'll use that as an example. Tesla, right? Elon Musk's goal with Tesla was to be the top-selling electric car manufacturer in the world, and he met that goal. Right? That's why Tesla is so successful. Now, by the way, he's being challenged by the Chinese, BVD and other companies in China. He may have already lost that crown of being the #1 electric car company in the United States. In the world. But there's no doubt that Tesla is the #1 electric car company in the United States, even as the big 3 legacy automakers try and build electric car businesses. They're failing badly. They lose tens of thousands of dollars on every car they sell, and they've cut back plans to manufacture electric cars, all by way of, I think, they don't have a clear vision for what is their mission, as a car company or as a transportation company, right? So you see this reflected in what's happened with railroads in the United States. Railroads, for roughly close to a century, 75 years anyway, railroad companies were the dominant transportation companies in the United States. But then as trucking rose and airlines rose and buses rose, the trains completely collapsed. And part of the problem was they saw themselves as being in the train business. Their mission was to be in the train business, not the transportation business, right? And so they got overtaken by competitors who saw the future differently. So for a company, as opposed to for a war, hopefully we're getting to the point where the war ends, right? And there's a good conclusion after the war ends. For a company where we're an ongoing enterprise, from time to time, we probably have to reform our mission, right? In order to keep it current, keep it vital, but most especially to keep it specific and achievable. Okay. And that's what really counts, right? So if we want to be, to go back to the case of trains, the dominant transportation company in the United States, what does that mean? That's a very nebulous goal. Does it mean that at least 50.1% of freight is carried by railroads? Is that what it means to be the dominant transportation company in the country? Or does it mean that we carry more passengers than any other train company, any other train, airline, bus company? What does that mean? To be dominant is too undefined to really be our mission. Okay. And so as we develop the mission for our companies, for our professional practices, even for our lives, I encourage you to think about how goals, how missions were defined for the various wars in which the United States has been involved, and how we can use that kind of specificity in creating our missions for our businesses and professional lives. So that's our show for today. And I thank you very much for joining me. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. My guest is Jason Gerardo, a fellow veteran, and he's going to be talking about the path to purpose. Jason is a coach, and he helps people enhance their lives through understanding, I think, some of the issues that we've been talking about today. Purpose, mission, they are certainly related concepts. So I invite you to join Jason and me tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific time. Then on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my show, Jiggers' Place. It's a chance for us to get together as the week starts coming to a close, have a cocktail, and talk about things completely unrelated to our professional lives. So this Thursday, I'm going to be talking about the Maltese Falcon and which is the better version, the book or the movie. Now, for those of you who have seen the movie, you're probably saying, oh, how could the book possibly be better? For those of you who read the book, you might be saying, oh, come on. I mean, books are always better than movies. So we're going to hash that out on Thursday afternoon while we sip a cocktail. So I invite you to join me. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is the next edition of Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then 1 week from today, again at 10 a.m. Pacific time, the next edition of People Making Money. And actually next Monday, nope. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we're good. So I thank you very much for joining me again today, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. Signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell. Courage at all times, my friends.